Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody, wherever you are in the world. I guess it's dark here. I guess for some people it's not so dark. Today's session, I'm going to just move the slide. I think, as Mary said, is about making something happen at the very earliest stages of switch use, and it's an area that I've been very interested in for quite a long time, really. The school where I used to teach, we had probably 40% of our pupils who we would term experiential learners. These are children who are non-intentional, who don't press switches when we present them, who don't interact with technology, and it was one of my greatest challenges was to look at how we might go about doing that and engage children with technology through the use of switches. A couple of months ago, I wrote a booklet called the Switch Progression Roadmap, and I will give you a link to download that. It's probably the best handout for this, certainly for this session and for the next session, because it will add some extra detail to some of the things that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, and also link it quite nicely to lots of software and things that you're likely to have in school or in your service or whatever, so that when I talk about switching at a particular level, you'll know that there's resources there that you can use for that. Whenever we look at using technology with people, it's really, really important that we think about positioning technology and presenting technology to children. Certainly from a point of view of behaviour, one of the things that I found over the years is very, very important is that when we're going to introduce technology, we do that gradually, and that we ensure that the students that we're working with are actually comfortable with having technology placed around them. You can imagine if a child with a quite severe intellectual disability is suddenly being grabbed by a colleague and all manner of things being screwed and fastened onto their wheelchair and put on their tray in front of them. That can be quite a challenge. For other children, just purely putting a switch onto their tray will give them a reason for wanting to throw that off. So these behavioural issues are really quite important, and there are some strategies that we can use in order to facilitate that. Perhaps the easiest one is to maintain some distance between the switch and the rest of the technology. And one of the best ways to do that is certainly with a wireless switch, so something like a jelly beamer, which will allow the switch to be placed onto the child's tray or mounted onto their wheelchair, and the computer and everything out of harm's way. Plus, of course, there's no wires there either to get in the way. The other thing, of course, is that we don't have to actually mount the switch at all, but certainly with some of these students. Just holding the switch and offering the switch to the student will work too. Use the floor, which is another quite interesting thing. People tend to think of ICT being in a special room with tables and special benches and all of this thing, but actually getting on the floor and doing things on the floor, trying to make sure that the person we're working with is comfortable. And be prepared to try all sorts of things, because nothing's going to work first time with most people. We're going to have to try all sorts of different strategies. The reason why I'm mentioning this, I suppose, before I start to talk about the students, is that even if we're working with experiential students who are not initiating, there's very good reasons for having the switch there and around. Often, if we're working at an experiential level, we'll present children with experiences, sounds, music, images, all manner of things, and hopefully engage them with that. And then if we do see some interest and some interaction, the switch is always there and ready to present to the child, and we can model the use of the switch before they even access it themselves. I'm just turning the slide. It seems to be a bit slow for me. At this early experiential level, pretty much it's about sensory things. It's about looking and listening, to some extent about tactile things too, and presenting the child with lots and lots of opportunities to experience those. And technology gives us some incredible tools to be able to do that. I've just put a few things along the side there. There's some toys there, bubble tubes, multi-sensory rooms, and some quite interesting things which you might not have thought about. There's the cast of Glee at the bottom there and Donald Duck. And the reason for that is largely because for these students, what we're trying to do is engage them. And in order to engage them, we need to present them with things that interest them. I think I've spent my whole career saying to people that, you know, it's one thing to present a child with a switch. It's another thing for them to have a reason to press it. And even at this very early experiential level, we need to make sure that the activities that we're presenting the child are something that they're actually interested in and want to look at. So the first thing I would say at this level is try and identify what it is that motivates the child that you're working with. Now, children don't kind of come with this list of things in their bag which say, I like this, I like that, I like the other. These are things that you need to find out. And you can do that by observation. You know, if this child's in your class or in your centre. You can do that by speaking to parents and find out exactly what it is that they do. And they can do that a little bit by trial and error. Many, many times we've worked with children, and we'll present them with a whole range of things and do some observations and make some very simple notes about how the child responds to that. Research tells us that children with very complex intellectual difficulties respond best to things that are familiar to them. Whenever I talk about this, I'm always reminded of a child that I taught who came into my class and for best part of almost a year pretty much didn't interact with anybody other than cry. He wasn't very happy at all. Wouldn't press a switch, wasn't really looking at anything or listening to anything. Until one fateful day that his mum came into school to pick him up to go off for a hospital appointment. As she walked into the classroom, she started to sing, Danny, Dan, Dan. The child's name was Dan. And just those few words that came out of Mum's mouth, the little boy started to smile. And in that moment, I knew that if we were ever going to get Danny to interact with things, we needed to use those things with and capture those. So before Danny's mum left, we managed to record her singing Danny, Dan, Dan on a Big Mac and present her with that. A quick chat with Danny's mum. We found out that his favourite song was The Spider and the Water Spout, and his sister loved to sing it, so we sent a Big Mac home at the weekend and got his sister to record that onto Big Mac. And just from those tiny little things, we were able to get Danny to start to listen to what was happening. We then put those sounds into PowerPoint, put some pictures of Danny's sister, and Danny was then looking and listening to what was happening on the computer in a way which he never did before. So it's important to try and find out what those things are. You can make all manner of kind of personalised resources. I'm guessing that many of you already do that. The kind of tools I suspect you use will be things like PowerPoint. I don't know whether you can do a hands up, but any hands up people who've used PowerPoint? I'm not seeing any. Oh, there we go.
And remember those tools, everyone. This is Mary. Remember those tools are in your upper left-hand corner for those of you that came on after our first explanation.
Sorry, that's my fault. What about tools like Switch It Maker? Do people use those tools? I'm seeing a few hands raised there. These are all open framework tools, and what they do is they enable us to use our own sounds and own images to create activities for children. So if one of the children that you're working with particularly likes Sesame Street, we could create an activity based on Sesame Street. We get some pictures of Sesame Street from the internet. We might get some sounds from YouTube or from websites such as findsounds.com, and create simple activities. We present these in an experiential way. So we would just play them. They would be playing on the computer, and we'd be encouraging the child to look and listen to what was happening. We'd also be making notes, because if we're giving children these experiences, it would be useful for us to write down what it is that how the child responded to that. And certainly at this stage, we'd be looking to provide a breadth of different activities. So, for example, we might have activities which have spinning patterns. Certainly if you work with some children who enjoy that type of multicoloured spinning pattern, you can create those very, very easy with Windows Media Player, or there's a downloadable version called Winamp, which would do that. Don't worry about these links. I'm going to tell you somewhere where you can get a document with all of them at the end. And make some simple notes. And the longer you do that, the more a pattern begins to emerge. You start to see things like, well, actually, Jenny really liked that activity with lots of red patterns, or she really enjoyed the patterns with yellow and black images on. And you start to build up a little pattern. And the reason for that is quite simple, that if we're trying to engage children with the activities that we're presenting, they're much more likely to engage with it if it's something that they particularly enjoy, so they actually enjoy looking at it. Having the switch there is really, really useful, because we can then begin to model the use of the switch. So I would have if I'm working with a child, have the child sat next to me. We would be sat with a switch, and we may be sitting in front of a computer screen or an interactive whiteboard, and I would use the switch, but I would tell the child what I was doing, and I would always cue them into what was happening. So let's have some more music, and I'd maybe use the child's hand to press the switch, or I would let them see my hand pressing the switch, and then we would watch. And I would be constantly cueing them into looking and listening. And at this level, what we're looking for is responses, and noting down those responses. Because like I said earlier, if we find something that a child really enjoys, they're much, much, much more likely to press the switch. The other little bit I put on the bottom of the slide there is the use of switch caps. So often I go into schools and I see switches. There'll be a big red switch on the child's tray. And when I press the switch, somebody from Sesame Street will come on the screen. But how do I know? And if we're working at a cause and effect level, that's what I have to learn. I have to learn that this switch is making Sesame Street characters come onto the screen. So using a switch cap and a picture of the Sesame Street, the characters on the switch, will really, really help the child understand that link. And it's an important link, as we'll talk about later. So at an experiential level, provide activities which are personalised. Make things in PowerPoint, Switch It, Make It, whatever open framework tools you want to use. Use things from YouTube. By and large, it really doesn't matter. Present children with as many different experiences as we can. Use the multi-sensory room, so bubble tubes, light. Use switch toys, certainly toys that move. And they don't have to be on the floor. You can hold them. Toys that vibrate, toys that talk. Use physical things. Connect up a switch to a fan, perhaps, and put some ribbons on the fan so we can see the action. And try lots and lots of things, modelling the switch press before we actually require the child to do it. Often we'll see in some of these children that they start to show interest and start to become more intentional. We'll often see that with hands coming out wanting to press the switch, where the child doesn't have any particular physical difficulty. And at that point, we then need to make sure that whenever the child presses the switch, something does happen. I mentioned switches, and then in my next slide, really, we need to talk about how we might introduce those switches. I mentioned earlier having them there all the time so that they're ready to go. So if the child shows some interest in pressing it, it's there for them to use. We can model the use of the switch with them as well. Most children that we come across can use common switches. That's big red switches, jelly bean switches, and those type of switches. There are some children, and I know we've got a lot of AT specialists with us today, that need more sophisticated switches, and that's where you guys come in, really. You guys have the expertise and the knowledge and experience to be able to recommend those kind of specialist switching solutions for schools and for your clients. Be prepared to do that. The other thing to consider is that switch positions often move, and I'm preaching to the converted, as we've got lots of AT specialists. But finding a switch position is sometimes problematic, and sometimes changes quite a lot. There's not much really to think about if we're choosing common switches. Pretty much, the things to think about are the colour and the size. The size of switch is important because the size of switch determines the size of the target area. So how big is that switch, and can the child actually get their hand out to it, or whichever part of the body they're pressing. And the colour is often important too, especially when you consider the colour of people's desks. Often I'll go in and the school have got lovely blue desks and they've got a blue switch on. It's almost impossible to pick it out. If you can choose a switch that's big enough for the child to press and big enough for the child to be able to see, pretty much you've got the right kind of switch. I put some switches on the top there, and I'm sure people are familiar with most of them. The big switch and the jelly bean switch, really useful, extremely robust. I've used them for years and years and years and years, and wouldn't replace them for anything. Other than perhaps the wireless versions. Wireless versions of switches just take away the additional problems of having wires and things fastened down onto the table. I often get asked by colleagues, what can we do about the wires? And the simple thing is get rid of them. Use wireless switches. And if you're worried about the child throwing a jelly bean or switch onto the floor, plug in a big switch and put the wireless switch underneath their tray or under their wheelchair out of the way, so they can do that. Excuse me. Where we put the switch is quite important, and certainly for children with more complex physical difficulties, it's incredibly important. There's so many times I go into schools and see children with quite profound cerebral palsy having a jelly bean switch at the end of their tray, and they're making huge, great sweeping movements, overarm movements to try and press that switch. And they can do it once or twice, but then it starts to hurt their hands, and it starts to tire their elbow, and it's really not a good switch movement. If you've got children who have complex physical difficulties, seek advice. Talk to an AT specialist. Talk to somebody from your school district or from a local authority if you're in the UK, and there'll be somebody there to help them. If there isn't any physical difficulties, plop the thing on the tray in front of them, show them where it is, tell them what it does, and be prepared and see what happens. If you're going to connect a switch to a computer, you will need a switch interface. When I first got involved with technology, I used to get lots of calls from people who said, I plugged the switch into my computer and now the sound won't work. And by and large, they've pretty much plugged it into the earphone socket. You do need some kind of interface between it, and the picture I've got there is an interface called a hitch interface. You plug the switch into one of the sockets, and you choose the method of access, and the method of access is slightly different for different types of programs. So often if you've got programs like something from Don Johnson, it might use the number keys. If you're using programs from Inclusive TLC, that would use the space bar. And by and large, you just press a button and press the switch, and pretty much it will work. I put some other mounting solutions there as well. There are lots of arms and clever things like that. But if you need that kind of thing, it's probably better to seek advice. Make sure you've got a switch cap on top of the switch, which indicates what will happen when the switch is pressed, and we're ready to go. I'm just waiting for my slide coming up. When we talk about cause and effect, what we're actually talking about is is an understanding that you can control things. It sounds quite basic, and it is basic, but actually it's the foundation upon which everything else that we do in our life is built upon. How can we learn anything else if we don't understand that we can actually control or have any influence over what happens around us? Most children have cause and effect. I've never met a child yet that doesn't have some understanding of cause and effect. A baby will cry, somebody will come. That's cause and effect. What we need to do is transfer that cause and effect skill and let them develop that in areas which are useful to them. In terms of using a switch, we'll press a switch and something will happen on the computer or will happen with a toy. And the understanding for the child is that they did it, that by pressing the switch they made that happen. And for some children that's quite a cognitive leap to be able to make that understanding. Having the switch cap works, and also providing the child with really good cueing and explaining to them what happens. I keep saying explaining, and I'm sure there are people thinking, but the child won't understand, but they do. And if they don't, it's still good to do it anyway. I wrote on my slide, it could be you, and this is common with switches, that the child will press a switch for something to happen on the computer, and certainly from a Priory Woods point of view, that may well be a dancing hippopotamus. However, they're not at all interested in pressing the switch to have a hippopotamus dance. They press it because their teacher dances when the hippopotamus comes on. And what they're pressing a switch for is the reaction that happens around them. So bear in mind that actually the reward the child's seeking for pressing the switch actually might be something that you're doing and not something the computer or the appliances and things that you're using is providing. And the other thing at this level is the breadth of experience. It's not useful to just use switches with a computer. We really need to add breadth, and that means looking at technologies such as plugging the switch into mains operated things by using a power link, or connecting it to toys and connecting it to the computer, bubble tubes, multi-sensory things, and providing a child with as many different opportunities to do that. When we at this level, in my understanding is that by and large there are 4 ways to operate a switch at this level. There's the press and hold activation. Some people call it momentary, where I keep my hand on the switch and something will happen. When I take my hand off, it will stop. That, by and large, is probably the easiest way to experience cause and effect with a switch. My hand's on, it must be me doing it. I take my hand off when it stops. It's not right for everybody, though. If you imagine a child with quite complex physical difficulties, with cerebral palsy, for example, they may not be able to do that, to keep their hand on a switch and maintain pressure. So it's just one way of accessing it. It's not necessary that every child accesses it in that way. Press and let go is the kind of discrete activation. I press the switch, I let go, and something happens. The classic example of that is the Big Mac. I press a switch and a message will play. Or on the computer, I press the switch and there will be an animation. Or I press the switch and the bubble tube will work for a set length of time. It's the most common way that switches seem to work. It's the most open to accidental pressing. If you imagine a child has involuntary movements and may accidentally press the switch, they'll still get the reward in a way which they wouldn't if we had to hold the switch down. I mentioned Big Macs there because by and large, if you're going to use switches in your classroom and you want to ensure that child gets lots of opportunities to practice using switches throughout the day, a Big Mac is certainly the best way to do that. I'm sure that if we threw out the question, come up with 2 ways in which you can use a Big Mac in your classroom, I'm sure that we could all come up with 20. Without a shadow of a doubt, anything that you're doing in your classroom, you can incorporate a Big Mac into that and give the child much needed experience and practice in using that switch. So press and hold the switch down, press and let go, press and take your hand away. The third method of activation is what we call press it again, which is often described as switch building. I'm sure that many colleagues are familiar with the concept of we press a switch and we build up a picture. For example, in some software I saw just recently, I press a switch and a cow's head will come on the screen, and I press it again, its body, and then its tail, and then 2 legs, and then another 2 legs. And after I've pressed the switch 6 times, I'll have built a picture of a cow, and I'll get an animation for a picture of a cow. Press it again. The idea for press it again kind of came years and years and years ago, and it came about when people were thinking, well, how could I add some breadth to simple press a switch and let go? And it kind of got a bit lost, really. What we see with switch building is people placing importance on the number of times a child can press a switch. So, for example, I've seen people's targets saying he will press a switch 4 times in order to achieve a desired effect. He will press a switch 6 times. And we see this often in software where we're having to press a switch 3 times, 5 times, or 8 times in order to build a picture. Those numbers mean nothing. They mean absolutely nothing. The important skill at this level is understanding that I may need to press that switch a number of times in order to complete a simple sequence. So I might need to go through, press it a number of times to get the reward that I want. The danger with that is, of course, that what it encourages is the child to bang the switch repeatedly, because really what they want is just the reward. They're not really interested in all of the intermediate stages. Now, there are ways to do this which don't involve building pictures. The best way is to tell stories. So, for example, I can have 5 slides in PowerPoint, and each one of those 5 slides is a different part of the story. So I start the activity, there's a picture of the bus, and I'll say to the child, look, what can we see? It's the bus. I wonder where we're going to go. And I'll encourage the child to press the switch. I won't say to the child, press the switch. And the reason for that is that I don't want the child to actually think about the switch much. I really want them to focus on the output of the switch, what the child's actually creating by pressing the switch, and not the process of pressing the switch itself. So, and they'll press the switch, and another slide will come up, and it will be a picture of the local park. And I'll say, oh, so we've gone to the park. I wonder what's going to happen. And I'll encourage the child to press the switch. And we'll tell a story by pressing that switch. You can imagine you're doing something very similar with a step-by-step communicator, where I can press the switch and I'll get part of the story or part of a song, and I'll press it again to get another part. And when I've pressed it a number of times, I'll get a reward. And it's the same with our story. We're still pressing a switch a number of times, but we're doing it in a way which is meaningful, rather than just bang, 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 bang. Oh, look, it's a cow. So pressing the switch, up pops a picture, talk about the picture, engage a child with what's happening. Look, what can we see? It's the school bus. I wonder what's going to happen. Let's see. And encourage the child to press the switch again. Whenever we're using switches, one of the things which always strikes me is that we don't really give children enough time to respond to switch pressing cues. We'll say to a child, oh, let's have some more music, please, or let's see another picture of the Cookie Monster. And then we don't. I went to a school just recently to take some videos, some best practice videos, and I sat and observed a number of school staff working with switch users, and videoed it, and I would watch the staff member would say, okay, let's have another picture of the Cookie Monster, and then they'd wait, and they'd wait for the child to press the switch, and then they'd intervene and press the switch for them. How long do you think that time was between between the child, the member of staff cueing the child to press the switch and the staff member pressing the switch themselves. It turned out to be less than about 15 seconds. Within 15 seconds, somebody had pressed the switch for the child. Now think about children with complex intellectual disabilities and think, well, how long might it take them to process what's happening right now? When that person is saying, somebody's saying to me, let's have another picture of the Cookie Monster, and I've got to remember that there's this switch on my tray, and I have to press this switch in order to change the picture. All of those things take time to process. And if we're going to work with children at the cause and effect level, we need to give them that time, which often means sitting on your hands. If you're the teacher in a class and this is happening in your class, there is an issue certainly with school staff in that the people that we work with, our teacher aides and such, that in essence we pay them to interact with children and sometimes they feel that they need to interact when actually in this instance it's much better not to sit back and just actually see what happens. So give children time to press a switch. The final method of switch access in this general kind of cause and effect level is what we call latching, which is turning something off and turning something on. And I put it here last, although there isn't any real kind of progression here. I've added it here last, largely because I think in my mind it's the most difficult. Because up until now, everything that we've done with the switch makes something happen. I press it and some effect is created. When we're using latching, the switch has two functions. In one press, it will turn something on, and another it will take it away. And cognitively, I think that's slightly more difficult than pressing a switch just to make something happen. I mean, there are lots of ways to use latching. Certainly lots of toys now use latching. You press the switch and the toy will play, and the elephant will walk, or the pig will snore, or whatever it is that's happened. And I press it again, it will stop. Certainly in a multi-sensory room, latching is used quite often. We press the switch and the bubble tube will start to play, and press it again and it will stop. And with music too, often that works quite nicely. A good way to teach latching is to have a switch between you and the child and let the child turn the music on, and then you turn it off. And of course what will happen is the child will then turn it back on and you can turn it back off, and you can have a right royal battle of who keeps the music on or not. And then switch it round, put some music on that you know the child actually doesn't like, and wait for the child to turn it off. And slowly, with that, we can start to introduce the concept of latching. There are some issues with using switches which are probably worthwhile mentioning, and that's the issue of switch tapping, which is always quite a difficult question, and one which I get asked almost all the time. Some learners, whatever we do, will tap a switch. They'll either tap it or bang it or try and belt it through the table, and it's a real issue for some children. We have to remember why that might happen, and there are a number of possible things. The first is that the learner might not actually understand at all what the switch is for. We've presented the child with something on their tray. It's bright, it's colourful, and you can see it, and they will touch it and play with it, and it may well be tactile and interesting, but they don't actually understand what it's for. So when we're thinking about cueing children with switch use, we need to reinforce exactly what the switch is for. So we have a picture on the switch of the effect that it's going to generate, and we're saying constantly, let's have more Cookie Monster, let's have more music, let's see where the story goes, let's see what the dog does, can we have some more balloons please? And really reinforcing the fact that the switch is actually doing something. I mentioned tactile there. That's often a real problem, where where children will stimulate by the tactile feel of the switch being clicked. Almost all switches provide tactile feedback because lots of children need that in order to know that they've pressed it. But some children will self-stimulate by tapping the switch for that. There's two strategies to that. The first one would be to completely remove the tactile nature of the switch, and there's a lovely switch there from AbleNet which has no moving parts whatsoever. So I can touch that switch and it will activate, but there's no tactile sensation at all. There are other switches which allow you to adjust the amount of pressure that's required in order to press the switch, and they usually have a kind of, the top of the switch will turn one way or the other. If you turn it all the way to the left, it's very easy to press, and turn it all the way to the right, it's very hard to press. And there's a body of thought which suggests that if we turn it all the way to the right, and it's very hard to press, that the tapping would be ignored and the child would stop tapping. By and large, that doesn't work. Removing the tactile sensation from the switch is much more useful. The other and the last reason why this sometimes happens is because the child's actually using the switch to demonstrate their understanding of cause and effect, but they're doing it to get your attention. So it's a behavioural issue. I was visiting a school in the UK, and this was a school for children on the autistic spectrum, and they'd had a long conversation in their staff room about how they might talk to children when children needed to be told off, and they didn't want to appear threatening in any way. So they came up with a solution whereby initially they would sing to the child because, hey, you can't be threatening when you're singing, really. So I went along to this school to do an assessment on a child, and the teacher's reporting that the child's banging the switch. So I sit at the back of the classroom, child's presented with the switch, they start banging the switch, and the teacher starts singing. Jimmy, Jimmy, don't press the switch. And then, of course, the teacher's wondering why the child's pressing the switch, banging the switch. They're banging the switch because you're singing to them, and demonstrating a really nice example of cause and effect. If I bang the switch hard enough, my teacher will sing. Or, which is more common, if I bang the switch hard enough, I will get attention from my teacher. So it's a behavioural issue, and something which we need to deal with in a different way. And by and large, the best way I've found of that is to encourage a child, once they've pressed the switch, to put their hands back on their knees or to move their hand away from the switch. And we need to reinforce that. While we're talking about switches, I've put a picture there of what's probably the strangest switch I've ever come across. And it's a switch which is designed for people who don't press switches. Basically what you do is you take a toy that the child might chew on, and you connect that switch to the computer, and by chewing on the toy, the child can operate the computer. Well, as you can imagine, that whole process is fraught with all manner of difficulties. If we give a child a switch and that switch is chewing on a plastic duck, how on earth does a child make the link between the activation of chewing and what happens on the computer? And worse, sometimes I've seen this particular switch being used with a rubber version of a cookie. I just think about that. We're working with a child who has a very complex intellectual difficulty, who struggles to understand what's happening in their world. We present them with something that looks like something they can eat, and in actual fact, we're expecting them to use chewing on that as a method of access for a computer. It's completely and totally silly, really. So don't get involved in using switches like that. A switch is a means to an end. It's a way of making something happen. The process itself is unimportant. It's understanding that they're making that happen. It's all about the outcome rather than the process itself. We need to be careful with switches too, that we don't go down the route of making the switch more interesting than it needs to be. There's a constant debate in schools in the UK about whether we should make switches tactile. So, for example, if we're working with a child who's at a very early experiential level and they're just beginning to kind of interact with things that we put onto their tray, would making the switch furry, perhaps, or have some tactile material on top of it more interesting and therefore more likely that the child would interact with it? My opinion of that is that actually all that will do is frustrate your attempts to assess what's actually happening with the switch. I think if a child's using a switch that's covered in fur because they like to feel fur, it would be difficult then to determine whether the child was using the switch purposefully or whether they were touching the switch because it was furry and nice to touch. I've seen some really strange examples of that where we've had switches which incorporate things like koosh balls and jelly and sparkly things. They all serve to do one thing, which is absolutely frustrate the ability to be able to make a clear assessment of what's happening with the child. We can never be sure that they're touching the switch because they know that it's going to make the Cookie Monster come on the screen. Instead, we're frustrated by the fact that they may well be touching it because it's nice to touch. So try and avoid those kind of switches too. It's important too to keep some records of what we're doing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about assessing in a second. But video is one of the best ways to do that. You can see in the little picture on the slide that we've set up a video camera on a switch arm, so that we can actually record that without interfering and walking around the child holding a video camera, and taking simple recordings so we can actually measure progress with children. Certainly at an experiential level, we can measure and look back and reflect on those videos to decide whether the child was actually looking at the screen, whether they were engaging, whether they were tracking. And these are all things that sometimes we miss because we're so busy in the classroom anyway. So taking videos and using those video clips to reflect upon practice. We can even save them out. We can put them together and use them as evidence of a child's progress. But we can also use them. We can also use them as a record of achievement that a child was able to do those things. I'm just turning my slide. Okay, so we've got a child using switches. We've gone through a process of identifying the kind of things that they like to use switches with. I mentioned earlier about giving a child a reason to press a switch, and it's really important. You know, if we present a child with an activity which isn't interesting, or one which they're very, very familiar with, or they're bored with in some instances. It was classic in my old school that we used a program called Blob. It's been around forever. It was made by Widget Software, and our children loved it. But they'd been using it for 2 or 3 years, and a lot of children were completely and totally switched off with the whole idea of using a switch to make Blob. Which is where anybody that's ever visited the Priory Woods website would know that that whole website is filled with interesting things for children to look at. Dancing hippopotamuses, Sesame Street monsters, music, cartoon characters. All of those things give a child a reason to press the switch, which is very, very important. So if they're using it, how then do we make that assessment that the child actually is able to press a switch with purpose and understand what's happening in that process? Personally, I think that's very difficult. it's a very difficult call. Some children, of course, we'll look at and we'll know instantly that they're able to press the switch and that they understand fully that by pressing the switch they're making Bob the Builder come onto the computer screen, or they're making the toy walk, or they're making the lights come on in the multisensory room. For other children, it's more complicated. I'm always reminded of an incident in my school where one of my colleagues said to me, "Come and have a look at John. We think John's finally managed to acquire cause and effect." And John was a visually impaired pupil with a very, very significant intellectual disability. His teacher had used a huge switch, something called a plate switch, which is probably 8 or 9 inches long by 5 inches wide, and placed that on John's tray. And John was busy chewing his fingers and dropping his hand onto the switch, and then looking at the computer screen. And to all intents and purposes, it looked very much like John was pressing a switch and then looking at the effects that he was producing by pressing it. But actually sitting and observing, pretty much we realised very quickly that John didn't have any understanding about what was happening. John's normal pattern of movement was to put his hands into his mouth and then let them drop onto his tray. And of course, when they dropped onto his tray, they pressed the switch. John's normal pattern of movement and behaviour was then interrupted by some music and images coming on the computer screen, which grabbed John's attention, and John would look at them for a short while. When they stopped, John would go back to his normal pattern of putting his hands into his mouth and dropping them onto the tray, which would trigger the switch again. So there was very little in terms of John's actual understanding of what was happening. What John was doing was what John naturally does. So with children like that, it's really, really important that we see them using switches in a wide variety of contexts. So it's not just a switch with a computer game or an activity on the computer. It switches with toys, it switches with battery-operated things, it switches with mains-operated devices, fans, lights, things in the multi-sensory room. It switches with communication devices, and trying to get as much breadth into that as possible. There's never a situation in teaching where if a child did something once, in one particular circumstance, that we would say that child has learned that concept. Imagine counting. If a child once went through and touched 5 blocks and read out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we would never say that child could count. We want to see that in lots and lots of different circumstances and lots of different situations before we'd be sure that a child had absolutely generalised that skill. And with switching, it's really just as important that the child actually generalise the skill before we move them on. I mentioned earlier that cause and effect it's the kind of base foundation upon which everything else we do is built. It's pointless moving on to doing step scanning if the child doesn't understand that by pressing the switch they are choosing, that they are making something happen. If they haven't got that skill, then using step scanning really won't work at all. So it's really, really important that we do that, and we're absolutely sure before we move the child on. There are a couple of things that we can do at this level too, if we've got a child and we're kind of not quite sure, and that's introduce 2 switches. And I'll put there for fun, and by and large that's what it is. I would put 2 switches on a child's tray, and I'd plug one into something, whether it's the computer or whatever, and I wouldn't plug the other one in, and I'd just see what the child would do with them. I'd just sit and observe, and if the child's consistently pressing the switch that's making Bob the Builder or the Cookie Monster come on the computer and ignoring the switch that does nothing, then I could be pretty sure that the child understands that pressing that switch is making Bob the Builder or the Cookie Monster come onto this thing. If they're pressing the other switch consistently, it may be that they don't like Bob the Builder or the Cookie Monster and they're pressing the switch to let me know that. If they're just randomly banging either of the two switches, then maybe they don't really understand cause and effect at all. The other reason why I like to introduce two switches at this point is just really just to have that level of experience. So I may well introduce two switches which do two different things. So one switch might do something on the computer, the other switch might turn some music on, or one switch might put the fan on, and one switch might put some music to listen to, or I may press a Big Mac to make elephant noises and press another switch to have an elephant walk. But just giving a child an opportunity to experience using two switches, and it doesn't matter that they're doing any kind of formal scanning really. It's just about experiencing that. There are lots of computer programs, cause and effect programs, which will work with two switches. So one switch will do one thing, and another switch will do another. Or one switch might cycle through things, and the other switch will select them. So often I'll present a child at cause and effect level with two switches, where pressing one switch will turn a page in a book, and the second switch will activate what's on page. It's all about just experiencing and generalizing the idea of pressing more than one switch, because this is something that we will need to do when we move more in towards step scanning or single switch scanning. Those four methods of activation all lead us towards that process. They all model really what we'll need when it comes to doing proper step scanning. So learning to press a switch, and then learning to press a switch a number of times. If you think about a two-switch step scan, the child has to press the move switch a number of times to reach the thing that they want, and the second switch to choose it. At this level, often I would introduce things like that, and I'd get the child to press the one switch to find what it was that they want, and then present them with the second switch in order to be able to do that, to be able to choose it themselves. So lots of breadth, lots of opportunities to do that, and try and do it as much as you possibly can. Remember that certainly for the students that we're talking about, many of them, using that switch will be their way of interacting with the world. The reason why I put a pencil there is because I'm reminded of my own childhood and my primary school, elementary school teacher giving me a pencil when I first went into school and spending the next 5 or 6 years teaching me how to use it, because my elementary school teacher knew that pencil would be my way of communicating my knowledge and ideas and opinions and understanding about things to other people in the wider world. I need to be able to have a tool to be able to do that. And for our switch users, that is their pencil. That is the way that they'll interact with their world. That is the way that they'll interact with the computer. That is the way that they'll communicate. So it's really, really, really important that we provide our students with as much opportunity to be able to interact with that and to use those switches as we absolutely possibly can. And that means engineering our day and our teaching day in order to facilitate that. I mentioned earlier that we can use technology such as Big Mac and step-by-steps. We can use those in just about anything that we do in the classroom. With computers, it's slightly more difficult. We just need to think about those open framework programs we talked about earlier, where we're making activities with the Cookie Monster. We could just as easily make activities to support anything that we're doing in the classroom, using those tools to create teaching resources which are interactive for switch users and for non-switch users too, and providing those opportunities throughout the day in order to be able to do that. That won't happen unless we make it happen. When I was last teaching, our switch users pretty much had one session every day, of about 10 or 15 minutes where they use switches. Nowadays, these days, we'll be looking at having switches in every single thing that we did in our classroom. So it's really, really important that we do that. I'm going to just move the slide, give you the last slide. Actually, Mary, you might have to turn the slide for me. I think I've lost my internet connection.
No worries. Here's the last slide. There you go.
Okay, this has got a list of 3 websites on there, which will be useful to. The first of which is AbleNet's website, where certainly all of the switches that I've talked about, communication aids and things like that, can be found. The second one is a document called the Switch Progression Roadmap. This is a document that I wrote a few months ago, which tries to explain in kind of practical terms how we might use switches in our classroom, how we might apply and teach those skills to children at lots of different levels. And certainly in that booklet you will find examples, teaching examples for every single one of the switch activation methods that we've done, plus ideas for how you might embed that into what you're doing in your classroom. And the final one, Mary mentioned about the Priory Woods website, the link for that's there. I've got one more, but